Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths and legends are told slowly and softly to help you gently fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and drift off to tonight's bedtime story. In an age when gods meddled in mortal lives and heroes chased glory, none embarked on a voyage as bold as Jason. His tale of stolen birthright, prophecy, and peril gathered Greece's greatest champions into a single, doomed company. This is the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Every hero's tale begins long before the hero is old enough to wield a sword or climb aboard a ship. In Jason's case, the story began with a throne stolen, a family displaced, and a prophecy that clung to his name like an unshakable shadow. Jason was the son of Aeson, rightful king of Iolcus, a city that had already grown weary of divine intrigues and royal disputes. Aeson was no mighty warrior nor scheming tyrant, but rather a steady ruler who had the misfortune of being related to a man with an ambition sharper than any spear. That man was Peleus, Aeson's half-brother. Where Aeson saw governance as stewardship, Peleus saw it as a game of survival, where victory belonged to those ruthless enough to take what they wanted. Peleus seized the throne not with the grace of a statesman, but with the cunning of a wolf. The usurpation was swift and decisive, leaving Aeson powerless and Jason, still a child, vulnerable to the designs of his uncle. Peleus might have killed the boy outright, but prophecies have a way of unsettling even the most determined tyrants. An oracle had whispered that Peleus should beware the man who would appear before him wearing only one sandal. Such a figure, it was said, would be the instrument of his undoing. Peleus, like all rulers haunted by prophecy, could not ignore the omen. He spared Jason's life, perhaps hoping to control the boy's fate rather than extinguish it. Aeson, fearing for his son's survival, entrusted him to the care of the centaur Chiron, that unlikely tutor of heroes who lived in the solitude of the mountains. There, Jason would grow far from the dangers of court politics and under the watchful eye of a creature who understood both the nobility and the folly of mankind. Chiron's lessons were not confined to the arts of hunting and warfare, though Jason learned both with skill. The centaur taught him the patience of the forest, the balance of the bow, and the healing properties of herbs, for a hero's wounds were as inevitable as his victories. More importantly, Jason learned from Chiron the art of leadership, not as domination, but as a kind of stewardship, an ability to inspire trust and cooperation in others. For in the sagas of old, the greatest heroes were rarely those who triumphed alone, but those who carried with them companions willing to follow them into peril. As Jason grew into manhood, the world around him seemed to murmur with expectation. The prophecy remained, as prophecies do, like a distant thundercloud promising a storm. Jason was no ordinary youth. He had the bearing of one chosen by fate, though whether fate would crown him or crush him remained unseen. The turning point came when Jason, now grown, set out to claim his rightful place in Iolcus. His journey was unremarkable until he came to a river swollen with rain. There he encountered an old woman struggling to cross. Jason, trained in both compassion and strength, lifted her and carried her across the torrent. In doing so, he lost one of his sandals to the rushing waters. The act seemed trivial at the time, a small price for an act of kindness. But as with all such moments, it would resound far beyond its occasion. For the old woman was no ordinary mortal. She was Hera in disguise, goddess and queen of Olympus, who had long despised Peleus for his disregard of the gods and his arrogance as a ruler. By aiding her, Jason secured Hera's quiet favour, though he could not yet know how essential her interventions would be. He arrived in Iolcus with only one sandal, his appearance at once humble and charged with the weight of prophecy. When Peleus saw him, recognition passed over the usurper like a chill wind. The oracle's words had materialized before his very eyes. Yet prophecies are rarely so direct. Peleus, unwilling to kill Jason outright and thereby tempt the wrath of gods, sought another path. If the prophecy could not be averted, perhaps it could be manipulated. He devised a challenge meant not to crown Jason, but to destroy him, dressing it as a noble test of heroism. He commanded Jason to prove his worth by journeying to the distant land of Colchis and retrieving the golden fleece. The fleece was no mere ornament. It was the shining hide of a divine ram, a relic of miraculous power, hung in a sacred grove and guarded by a sleepless serpent. It represented not only wealth and kingship, but also the impossible, a prize no mortal could seize without divine aid. To send Jason after it was to send him into certain doom, cloaked in the language of honour and destiny. Peleus reasoned that if Jason perished, the prophecy would be neutralized. If by some miracle he succeeded, Peleus would still be free of the task himself, his rival exhausted by impossible trials. Jason, however, did not see the trap for what it was. He accepted the challenge with the confidence of youth, and the sense that his life had always been leaning towards this moment. To retrieve the golden fleece was to restore his family's honour, to reclaim the throne of Iolcus, and to carve his place among the legends of Greece. Perhaps he also sensed that his life, shaped by exile and prophecy, would never find peace in anonymity. He would either rise to glory or be undone in pursuit of it, and both outcomes seemed preferable to obscurity. Thus, with the consent of Hera, the resentment of Peleus, and the unshaken resolve of his own heart, Jason set in motion one of the greatest adventures the Greek world would ever know. The task before him was monumental, a journey not only across seas and lands, but through the very fabric of myth itself. He would not undertake it alone. Heroes from across Greece would soon gather to his cause, drawn by the promise of glory, friendship, or simply the desire to etch their names into the fabric of eternity. But for now, it was enough that Jason had accepted the burden of destiny, one sandal short of a full prophecy. His eyes set on Colchis and the gleam of a prize that waited across the edge of the world. The voyage had not yet begun, but the current of fate had already shifted. The stolen throne of Iolcus trembled. The gods turned their gaze to the mortal seas. And Jason, son of Aeson, prepared to become not merely a claimant to a crown, but the leader of an expedition that would test the limits of what it meant to be human. A quest of such magnitude demanded more than courage. It demanded a vessel capable of carrying not just men, but destiny itself. Jason's acceptance of Peleus' challenge spread across Greece like wildfire. Whispers of the Golden Fleece stirred old warriors and young adventurers alike, each one hearing in it the promise of immortality. For myths are nourished not only by gods, but by those who dare to grasp at glory. And so, before companions could be assembled, a ship had to be built. A ship unlike any the world had ever seen. The task fell to Argus, a craftsman of rare skill whose hand seemed guided by the divine. Under the quiet oversight of Athena, goddess of wisdom and craft, he constructed a vessel of unprecedented strength and beauty. This was the Argo, a ship long and slender, swift as an arrow, yet sturdy enough to face the wrath of both sea and storm. Into its prow was fitted a timber carved from the sacred oak of Dodona, a tree whose whispers carried the voice of Zeus himself. This gave the Argo something no other ship possessed: a living spirit, an oracle that would speak in warning and in guidance, a reminder that the gods sailed with them as both protectors and overseers. The Argo was not just wood and sail. It was an idea made manifest, a symbol of collective ambition. It embodied the audacity of mortals who dared to sail beyond known waters, and its very construction was a challenge to the gods, for it declared that men were ready to test the edges of their world. Once completed, its gleaming hull rested at the harbour, awaiting the footsteps of heroes. And heroes came. They came from mountains and islands, from palaces and wilderness, drawn as if some invisible thread pulled them toward Jason's cause. Each bore a name that would echo through legend, though in that moment they were not yet legends but men and women of flesh, boasting skills, ambitions and flaws. First among them came Heracles, the son of Zeus himself, whose labours were already the stuff of rumour and awe. His presence lent the expedition both gravitas and danger, for where Heracles went, trouble followed like a loyal hound. He joined not out of loyalty to Jason, but because the sea promised a respite from his endless labours, or perhaps simply because adventure was his natural state. His strength alone was enough to anchor the expedition in the realm of possibility. Next was Orpheus, the poet and musician whose songs could charm beasts, trees, and even the stones beneath his feet. Where Heracles carried brute force, Orpheus carried the subtle power of harmony, the ability to soothe chaos with melody. He came not for kingship or fleece, but because journeys themselves were worthy of song. And he knew that this voyage would be sung long after the oars had stilled. From the wilds came Atalanta, swift-footed huntress, raised in the forests, and as comfortable with bow and spear as any man. Though some traditions claimed she did not sail with the Argonauts, in this telling she stood proudly among them, her presence a reminder that skill and courage were not bound by gender. She came for the challenge, for the chance to pit her speed and strength against the perils of the unknown, and because adventure was her only true inheritance. Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, sons of Leda, came as well, one famed for horsemanship, the other for boxing, bound together by brotherhood as much as by blood. Their bond was unbreakable, and where one went, the other followed. They embodied loyalty itself, and in their partnership the crew would later find a symbol of unyielding solidarity. From the line of Aeacus came Peleus and Telamon, brothers who carried with them the weight of their own ambitions. Peleus would one day sire Achilles, greatest of the warriors at Troy, but in this age he was still a man striving for renown. Telamon, strong and determined, came with equal hunger for glory, his eyes set on carving his own name into the fabric of Greece's heroic age. Others joined in droves, each a figure worthy of their own tale. Idas and Lynceus, brothers as well, one renowned for his unmatched strength, the other for his piercing sight that could see through earth and stone. Euphemus, blessed with the gift of walking upon water. Calais and Zetes, winged sons of Boreas, who carried the swiftness of the north wind in their blood. Typhus, chosen as the ship's helmsman, skilled in reading stars and waves. Meleager, already famed for his role in the Caledonian boar hunt. And many others whose names, though sometimes dimmed by time, added their weight to the oars of the Argo. Each hero came with his or her own reason, to escape obscurity, to prove valour, to seek favour from gods, or simply to grasp at whatever chance destiny offered. Some joined for friendship, others for rivalry. Together they formed a company both noble and flawed, united not by loyalty to Jason alone, but by the shared hunger for glory. When the Argo at last rested in the harbour, its deck thrumming with the footsteps of heroes, the ship became more than a vessel. It was a living myth, a floating congregation of Greece's most daring. The air buzzed with anticipation, with the weight of possibilities both triumphant and disastrous. Yet woven into their departure was a thread of hubris. For though they were blessed by Athena's craft and Hera's quiet favour, they were also cursed by the jealousies of gods who do not easily tolerate mortal boldness. To gather so many heroes in one place was to invite both admiration and destruction. The Argo carried not only the hopes of Jason and his companions, but also the inevitable doom that clings to every mortal who seeks to rival divine achievement. And so, the day came when the Argo slipped into the water, its oars flashing like wings, its prow cutting a path into the open sea. The voices of their kin and country rose in farewell from the shore. A mingling of pride and dread, for those left behind knew that not all who departed would return. The Argo carried with it both blessing and curse, both courage and folly, both mortal strength and divine meddling. The voyage had begun. Ahead lay islands and storms, monsters and gods, trials both absurd and lethal. But in that moment, as the sea opened before them, the Argonauts were united in purpose, believing themselves invincible, bound together by hope and hubris in equal measure. The oars struck the waves in unison, and with every stroke the world grew smaller behind them and larger before them. The Argo, the ship with a voice of oak and a crew of heroes, moved steadily into the unknown, carrying Jason toward a destiny that would prove both glorious and ruinous. The sea, ever indifferent to mortal ambition, became the first true adversary of the Argonauts. For a time, the winds favoured them, and the Argo cut through the waters as if urged on by the gods themselves. Yet heroes cannot remain long without trial, and it was not the sea, but human temptation that first tested their resolve. Their voyage brought them to the island of Lemnos, a place peculiar in both tragedy and opportunity. Its people were women alone, for the men of Lemnos had all been slain in a fit of vengeance. Neglect and betrayal had driven the women to massacre their husbands, leaving a kingdom without men, haunted by silence and regret. When the Argonauts arrived, they were greeted not as intruders, but as saviours. For the women, weary of solitude, saw in the crew a chance to renew their lives and their lineage. What began as hospitality soon slipped into indulgence. The heroes, welcomed into homes and beds, forgot their quest. Days became weeks, and the Golden Fleece seemed a distant abstraction compared to the immediate comforts of feasting and embrace. Only when Heracles, less enticed than the others and impatient by nature, reminded them of their duty, did they stir from their languor. Reluctantly, they boarded the Argo again, leaving behind a mingling of gratitude and resentment on the shores of Lemnos. Already it was clear that their greatest danger might not always come from monsters, but from within, from the ease with which purpose could dissolve into distraction. Their next stop brought them to the land of the Doliones, whose king Cyzicus received them with generosity. Supplies were exchanged, and the two peoples parted as friends. Yet fate, ever cruel in its irony, had not finished with them. Driven back by stormy winds to the same shores under the cover of night, the Argonauts were mistaken for enemies. In the confusion of battle, friend clashed with friend, and blood was spilled needlessly. By dawn, the Argonauts discovered to their horror that they had slain their hosts, including King Cyzicus himself. Grief weighed heavily upon them, for this was not the glory of heroes, but the tragedy of misrecognition. A reminder that not all wounds were inflicted by monsters. They buried Cyzicus with honours, offering rites to appease both gods and shades, but no ritual could cleanse them of the knowledge that their own hands had brought about an innocent death. In this sorrow, Jason began to understand the darker side of leadership. The burden of decisions that could not be undone. The scars that honour could not conceal. Still, the sea pressed them onward. Their next challenge came not from mortals, but from creatures of torment, the Harpies. These winged monsters plagued the blind seer Phineus, snatching food from his lips, leaving him starving though never dead. The Argonauts encountered him wasted and tormented, his knowledge vast yet unusable, for his suffering consumed him. Here the Boreads, Calais and Zetes proved their worth. Gifted with wings from their father Boreas, they pursued the Harpies across the sky, driving them off under the watchful eye of Zeus, who decreed they must not slay the creatures, but merely banish them. Thus freed from his torment, Phineus rewarded the Argonauts not with gold or treasures, but with guidance, a prize far more valuable. For ahead lay the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, a terror that had shattered many ships. These two great stones, poised like jaws, would slam shut upon any vessel daring to pass between them. Phineus advised the Argonauts to release a dove before attempting the crossing. If the dove passed through safely, the ship should follow quickly. They obeyed. The dove shot between the rocks, losing only a few tail feathers, and the Argonauts rowed with desperate strength. As the stones closed, the Argo slipped through, her stern grazed but intact, the sacred timbers of Dodona whispering with approval. Behind them, the rocks stilled forever, their power broken by the daring of men. The sea beyond opened wide, and the Argonauts knew they had crossed not merely a strait, but a threshold into the deeper unknown. These trials revealed the dual nature of their voyage. Each challenge tested their unity, and each victory revealed the fragility of that unity. On Lemnos, they nearly lost themselves to comfort. With the Doliones, they succumbed to tragic confusion. With Phineus and the Harpies, they discovered that salvation often depended not on strength, but on cunning and divine guidance. And with the Symplegades, they proved that survival required not brilliance, but unyielding coordination. Every oar pulling as one. Jason's leadership was not the fiery inspiration of Achilles, nor the cunning strategy of Odysseus. Instead, it was something quieter, built on endurance, on the ability to keep moving forward when hesitation or despair might have broken lesser men. He was no flawless commander, but he held the expedition together, and in the dangerous arithmetic of survival, that was enough. The gods, too, revealed their presence in every trial. Hera's favour shadowed Jason, urging events subtly in his favour, while Zeus permitted both suffering and reprieve, as though the journey itself were a test devised by Olympus. At times, divine aid felt like mercy. At others, it resembled mockery, as if the gods took amusement in watching mortals dance at the edge of doom. The Argo pressed on, scarred by its journey but not broken, carrying within it a crew tempered by both failure and triumph. The sea stretched endlessly before them, each wave concealing new perils. Yet already the legends were growing. The island of women, the accidental slaughter of a king, the defeat of the Harpies, the conquering of the clashing rocks. Each event became a thread in the tapestry of their fame, weaving together a story that was equal parts heroism and hubris, triumph and tragedy. Still, this was only the beginning. Beyond lay Colchis, the land of the Golden Fleece, and challenges far greater than storms or monsters. For in Colchis waited not only impossible tasks, but the intervention of hearts and gods alike. The Argonauts had proven they could survive, but survival alone would not win the fleece. Jason's true test still lay ahead, where leadership would demand not endurance alone, but choices that would bind him forever to both glory and ruin. The Argonauts, weathered by storms, grief and triumph, at last reached the shores of Colchis, a land at the far edge of the known world. Here the sun seemed to rise closer to the earth, gilding the mountains with a light both beautiful and forbidding. Colchis was ruled by King Aeetes, son of Helios, a man of fiery temper whose kingdom reflected both wealth and cruelty. The Golden Fleece, the object of Jason's quest, hung within a sacred grove, nailed to the branches of an oak and guarded by a serpent so vast and sleepless that even the bravest warrior quailed at the thought of facing it. Jason came before Aeetes not as conqueror, but as supplicant, for to claim the fleece he required the king's consent, or at least the semblance of it. Aeetes, however, was not so easily deceived. He recognized in Jason a threat, a foreigner daring to covet what was his by divine inheritance. Yet rather than slay the intruder outright, Aeetes chose a path familiar to tyrants. He set tasks so impossible that they would destroy Jason without staining his own honour. The king demanded that Jason yoke a pair of fire-breathing bulls, creatures forged of bronze, whose hooves struck sparks and whose nostrils belched flame. Once yoked, Jason was to plough a field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these seeds would spring the earthborn warriors, a host of armed men who would rise from the soil itself relentless and fierce. Only after completing these labours, it is declared, would Jason be deemed worthy of approaching the grove where the fleece hung. It was a challenge designed to kill, a performance stage for the gods' amusement. Jason, though bold, was not deceived by the king's intentions. He understood that no mortal strength alone could yoke beasts of fire or defeat an army birthed from the earth. And here fate intervened in the form of Medea, daughter of Aeetes, a woman whose power rivaled that of any hero, though her weapons were of magic, not steel. Medea was a priestess of Hecate, skilled in enchantments and herbs, her knowledge as vast as her will was conflicted. Bound by blood to her father, yet compelled by forces beyond her control, she found herself torn. For Hera and Athena, unwilling to see Jason fail, had enlisted Aphrodite in their schemes. And Aphrodite, with her inexhaustible arsenal, loosed the arrow of Eros, striking Medea's heart. Against her reason, against her loyalty, she felt herself drawn to Jason with a passion that burned hotter than the bulls her father commanded. What followed was less the triumph of Jason's heroism than the quiet, desperate courage of Medea's betrayal. She provided Jason with a salve made from enchanted herbs, a charm that would shield him from flame and steel for a single day. She counselled him on how to face the earthborn warriors, not with brute force, but with guile. Armed with her wisdom, Jason stepped into the arena Aeetes had prepared for his destruction. The fire-breathing bulls roared, their hooves scorching the earth. Yet Jason, shielded by Medea's spell, gripped their horns and forced them beneath the yoke. The crowd that gathered gasped, for no mortal had ever subdued the bronze beasts. He ploughed the field, sweat and fire mingling in the air, and sowed the dragon's teeth into the furrows. From the soil rose warriors clad in bronze, swords gleaming, eyes empty of mercy. But Jason, remembering Medea's words, cast a stone among them. Confused, the warriors turned on one another, believing their brothers to be foes. They slaughtered each other until the field lay quiet, soaked not with harvest, but with blood. Aeetes, watching from his throne, seethed with rage. Jason had accomplished the impossible, yet the king's heart hardened rather than yielded. The fleece remained out of reach, guarded still by the sleepless serpent, and Aeetes plotted to destroy the Argonauts in the night. But Medea, bound now more to Jason than to her father, warned him of the treachery. Thus the theft of the fleece became not an act of heroism, but of love twisted by divine compulsion. In the silence of the sacred grove, Jason and Medea approached the oak, where the fleece glimmered, radiant even in darkness. Before it lay the serpent, vast as a river, its coils endless, its eyes glowing like embers that had never dimmed. Jason, for all his strength, could not have faced such a guardian unaided. Medea, invoking the powers she served, lulled the serpent with spells and herbs, her voice weaving through the night like a net of shadows. Slowly the monster's coils slackened, its eyes drooped, and its body fell into an enchanted sleep. Jason seized the fleece, its golden wool blazing in his arms like captured sunlight. Their triumph, however, was steeped in betrayal, for Medea's aid couldn't remain a secret. To ensure their escape, she committed an act that would forever stain her name and bind her fate to Jason's. Pursued by Aeetes' fleet, the Argonauts found themselves trapped, the king's ships closing fast. It was then that Medea lured her younger brother, Apsyrtus, into a meeting under pretence of trust. Accounts differ on the cruelty of what followed. Some say Jason struck the blow, others that Medea herself did, but the result was the same. Apsyrtus was slain, and his body cut into pieces, cast into the sea to delay their father's pursuit as he stopped to gather the fragments. This was no heroic victory, but a desperate crime, a line crossed from which there could be no return. The fleece had been won, but at the cost of kinship and innocence. Medea had severed her ties to her family, her homeland, and her past, choosing instead to bind herself to Jason, a man she barely knew, compelled by love that was as much divine curse as personal choice. The Argonauts, carrying both treasure and blood guilt, fled Colchis into seas that seemed to grow darker with every oar stroke. The golden fleece shimmered, but its radiance could not mask the shadows that clung to it, nor could it erase the knowledge that their triumph had been purchased not by strength of arms alone, but by betrayal, sorcery, and death. Jason was lauded as a hero, yet beneath the golden prize lay the truth. Without Medea, his quest would have ended in fire and blood on the fields of Colchis. The voyage home awaited, but it would not be a return to simple glory. For though they carried the fleece, they also carried the weight of Medea's betrayal, the wrath of Aeetes, and the subtle, relentless gaze of the gods, who had not finished shaping their destinies. The voyage back was no simple retracing of waters, no neat reversal of oar strokes. The gods, ever fond of turning mortal journeys into labyrinths, demanded more wandering, more suffering, as if the golden fleece were not already stained with enough blood to fill a small sea. The Argonauts, tired but bound by momentum, set their prow toward home, carrying with them not only the shining ram's hide, but also Medea, the sorceress, the scandal, and the future ruin of Jason. They stopped first in the domain of Circe, the aunt of Medea, priestess of uncanny powers. For Medea, having betrayed her father and murdered her brother in their escape, carried the stench of miasma, spiritual pollution so thick that even the gods held their noses. Circe performed the ritual purification, muttering ancient words and burning foul herbs, but even she could not scour the stain of familial blood. Purification here was less a true cleansing than a bureaucratic stamp of approval, as though Medea's crimes had merely been filed away in the cosmic ledger under resolved. Jason watched, both relieved and uneasy, for he had taken not just a wife, but an accomplice who could never be free of divine suspicion. Their next challenge lay not in storms or spears, but in song. The Argonauts passed the islands of the Sirens, those cruel singers whose voices promised knowledge and pleasure, but delivered only death upon the rocks. The oarsmen felt the pull of the sound, like memory tugging at the marrow. But Orpheus, that melancholy musician, played his lyre louder, drowning temptation with melody of his own. The siren's song faltered against his counterpoint, proving that music, in the end, may kill as well as save. The men rode on, their ears full of human song rather than divine cruelty, though some never forgot the half-heard notes of the sirens, haunting them long after the sea had faded. Still further trials waited, because no Greek hero ever returned from glory without being battered first by a final absurdity. In Crete stood Talos, a bronze giant left behind by the gods as an early experiment in homeland security. He circled the island's shores, throwing rocks at incoming ships, a one-machine coastguard with no budget cuts. His body contained a single vein of molten ichor, sealed at the ankle with a bronze nail. Medea, always the solution and the problem, bewitched him into madness. Talos stumbled, struck his vulnerable ankle, and spilled his life's fire into the sand, collapsing with a thunder that shook the sea. Another wonder undone, another monstrous guardian silenced, not by Jason's spear or oars, but by the mind and malice of his foreign wife. At last the Argonauts reached Iolcus. The city had not grown nobler in their absence. Peleus, grey and still firmly enthroned, received the fleece not as a token of surrender, but as a curiosity, a prize to gawk at. He had demanded Jason fetch it, thinking it an impossible errand, and now that it was brought before him, glowing faintly in its sacred gold, he merely shrugged the way a king shrugs when bureaucracy forces him to acknowledge a minor victory he never expected. No throne was yielded, no crown was placed on Jason's head. Heroism, it seemed, could win applause but not power. Medea, however, was not content with shrugs. A princess of Colchis, abandoned by her family, she had burned every bridge behind her. Exile was her only inheritance, and vengeance her only dowry. She devised a deception worthy of Olympus. Convincing Peleus's daughters that their father could be rejuvenated by boiling, she demonstrated upon a ram, transforming it from old to young with a hidden trick of sorcery. Trusting her words, they cut their father to pieces and cast him into the cauldron. No renewal came, only the stench of cooked king. Peleus's reign ended not with battle or rebellion, but with a household horror orchestrated by a foreign bride. Jason had the throne within reach, and yet the act of murder, though not by his hand, stained him. Iolcus cast him out, not as a conqueror but as a scandal. Exile followed. Jason and Medea, left with their children, wandering from city to city, received at first as curiosities and later as cautionary tales. The Golden Fleece, once a promise of divine favour, now hung like a bad joke, a relic of a quest whose end result was neither kingdom nor peace, but exile and infamy. Jason had gathered the greatest heroes of Greece, crossed seas, slain giants and defied kings, only to find that glory could not be spent like coin, nor worn like a crown. Here lies the irony. The quest had always seemed the making of him, yet it became the unmaking. The fleece won him no throne. The gods had used him as entertainment, a pawn in a game where his suffering served only the purposes of divine narratives. His crew dispersed, each hero drifting into his own minor tale. The Argo herself, once the pride of the sea, was left to rot on a lonely shore, her timbers groaning as though even wood could feel regret. Jason lived on, but not gloriously. Medea's story would continue, darkening into infanticide and exile upon exile, but Jason's became a slow decline, the kind reserved for men whose best days lie not ahead but decades behind. Once he had been the leader of heroes, the prince with a destiny, the man who dared confront kings and monsters. In the end, he was merely an old man who had once touched glory, abandoned by gods and mortals alike. He died ignobly, crushed beneath the rotting hull of the Argo, as though the ship itself, weary of carrying his failures, had chosen to fall upon him. And so Jason's tale became not a hymn of triumph, but a parable. That ambition without wisdom breeds disaster, that divine favour is fickle, and that glory borrowed from the gods carries interest too steep for mortals to pay. He was not remembered as the greatest of Greek heroes. Heracles would take that mantle, Achilles too, but as the man whose shining quest led only to ruin. His story endured, not because it inspired, but because it warned. The Argonauts disbanded, their names scattered like seeds across the wide soil of myth. Some grew into legends of their own, others dwindled into footnotes. But Jason remained the cautionary centre, proof that one may grasp the golden fleece, and still end with nothing but ashes, scandal, and exile. A man who sought a throne, and won only a grave, buried beneath the wreck of the very ship that had once borne him to greatness. Thus ended the voyage of the Argonauts, not with a kingdom, but with a curse of glory.